We are pleased to have with us on Liberty Dispatch interviews our friend Jonathan Wellum. Jonathan is the founder and CEO of Rocklinc Investment Partners, which began in 2009 and is an independent, research-driven investment management firm focusing solely on creating portfolios of high-quality assets. Jonathan currently serves on the advisory board of the Oak Centre, based in Hamilton, Ontario, and is a board member of the Canadian National Christian Foundation. He also serves as an elder at Trinity Baptist Church in Burlington, Ontario. Jonathan has been married to his wife Heidi for 30 years, and they have 4 adult children. They also have 1 son-in-law and 1 daughter-in-law, and recently have welcomed their 2nd grandchild. Jonathan holds a Bachelor of Commerce and a Master of Business Administration degree from McMaster University and a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Waterloo. He's also completed a Master of Arts degree from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and he holds the designation of Chartered Financial Assistant. Jonathan, it's great to have you on Liberty Dispatch interviews. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, guys. It's great to speak with you again. Appreciate your program and all the work you're doing.
Jonathan, what haven't you done? That's quite the bio.
Well, I had misspent 80s. In the 80s, I spent most of the 10 years in university, I guess, and I'm glad I got out and started working. So don't worry, I've been 35 years in the workforce paying too much taxes. So.
Well, that's funny because your misspent 80s sounds a lot more productive than my misspent years trying to be a rock and roller and driving in vans and sleeping on random kitchen floors. So there's one way you can either get degrees or get a degree in delusion. I don't know. I'd pick yours, but it's good to have you on, brother.
Yeah.
So, Jonathan, there's a few things we wanted to talk about, and we wanted to have you on to talk about it because of your experience, the work you do, your expertise in these areas. The first thing we wanted to talk about was the somewhat now temporarily maybe pause tariffs on Canada from Donald Trump. And last week, Matt and I did an episode and we played a portion of a podcast with Brian Lilly and some economists. And one of the things that they put forth was that part of the reason behind these tariffs and really Trump's interaction economically with other countries is essentially he's wanting to shake up, he's wanting to reinvent, he's wanting to restructure the global economy and the United States' place in it, primarily providing free military care, subsidies, and a lot of money, and them wanting to have other people do their fair share and see the United States reemerge in even stronger ways a global economic power. That was one take. We also covered another interview where this investigative journalist was exposing essentially how the Communist Chinese Party is using Canada, specifically Vancouver, as a money laundering system, and they have tremendous influence. And the journalist put forth the idea that Trump really tamping down on Canada is his way of saying we cannot have these Chinese interests that close. It's too close for comfort. So Canada, you have to tidy up, and you need to make sure that you deal with the overbloated influence of the CCP in you. So I don't see those as being mutually exclusive. It might be both of those, but I wanted to, with that as a setup, because our audience has heard us talk about those. What do you perceive is really going on with Trump's interaction with Canada and Mexico with these tariffs? Is it some of those things? Is there something else you're seeing? I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
I think those are both key issues, both of them. It's not one or the other. I think it's both of them. So let's just look at those quickly. The first one, when you look at this issue of immigration and the drug cartels and the Chinese influence, it is unbelievable the level of Chinese influence in this country, and we've seen that already in our Liberal government and them influencing some parts of the election, and then Trudeau, of course, hiding some of that information and not releasing some of it. But the drug trade is massive, and it has been for decades, and we've been letting that go on for quite some time, especially through Vancouver, and then money laundering through the casinos, and then into the real estate market and so forth. The assembling of fentanyl and then just distributing that, not just at the border, but of course through the trucking industry also. So that's a serious issue. Trump has made it very clear that he's got 100,000 Americans dying every year. It's outrageous, and he's concerned and he wants to stop it. It's amazing that we have in our political class a whole group of people that simply don't care what's happening. We've seen in our own streets the last number of years, in particular during the Trudeau regime, a large uptick in homelessness and drug addictions on our streets. So that's a very important issue. The other one is borders. As you also know, Trudeau has flooded our country with massive amounts of immigrants, and they are not being screened that well. And we've heard about this already. We've got people that were involved in ISIS coming into the country. And so again, that they're coming into Canada and then they're going across the border. It's a very porous border. And so Trump, you see what he's doing at the southern border, and he's going to do the same thing here in Canada. So those two issues are real issues. They're important issues to Trump. Peter Navarra and other ones in his cabinet have made it very clear they're going to stop it. And so that's why they got into this trade spat. The trade situation, I think, is a sideshow in one sense, because the Canadian and U.S. trade is quite balanced. It's not unbalanced. There's a slight deficit. It's not a large deficit when you consider that the overall trade deficit for the U.S. is now $1 trillion. And the deficit with us is maybe 50, 60 billion. But that's largely energy and commodities. And so they need our energy at this point and commodities. And the reality is we subsidize their energy industry, because when our oil and gas flows across the border, it goes at a large discount to the global spot price. And that's because we are landlocked. We don't have, we can't get our energy and oil to the coast. And so we have to sell it to the US. It's heavy oil, and they take it at a nice discount. So our trade is very good with the US. It's not a big issue at all. So then you go to, so that's that issue. The second issue that you raise is there's no question that Donald Trump has figured out, as anyone with any brain, that the U.S. is broke. Okay, the U.S. is a broke state. It's $37 trillion in debt. It's adding about $2 trillion a year in deficit. And then they've got $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Those are promises that they've made to their people that they have no money set aside if you present value it. And it could be even larger than $100 trillion. $100 trillion is actually a conservative number. And so he is very concerned that over the last 30, 40 years, especially since China got into the World Trade Organization, that the globalists have really been gutting many of our Western countries from manufacturing base and moving it offshore. So we've lost a lot of our productive capacities, manufacturing capacities. We saw that in the COVID years. When our supply chains got interfered with, we realized how dependent we were on, India, China, places in the Far East, and so on. And so he's talked about this for 30 years. This is not something that's new. And so what he wants to do is he wants to bring all that manufacturing back. And the way you do that is you penalize companies if they do not produce in your country. And so it's not really that profound, and I think difficult to understand. He wants it all back into his country. And so the way he's doing that is he's now putting tariffs on China. He's putting tariffs. He'll put probably tariffs on Europe. Europe is not a fair trading partner, not like Canada. We're much more a fair trading partner. They do not allow U.S. goods into European Union in any large numbers, at least easily. And so he's recognized that. So what he wants to do is turn the U.S. back into a manufacturing powerhouse that's independent of the rest of the world. Now, where does Canada come into that? We are a rich, rich country with a lot of commodities and resources that the U.S. would love to have. Don't listen to him when he says that he doesn't need us and, we're irrelevant and so forth. That's a lot of nonsense. We've got more oil than they do. We've got more uranium than they do. We've got more potash than what they have, a lot of base metals and so forth, including rare metals. And that's important to him. So he wants to, reconfigure the U.S.-Mexico Canadian agreement that he did back in 2018. He's already said that this is all set up for renegotiating that. And so I think, Canada's got to figure out how we want to interact with the U.S. I don't really see tariffs as a threat for Canada immediately anyway. that's just a big stick that he's using for us to clean up our drug act and our borders. And the other last part I'd say is that he's very concerned about the Chinese and Russian influence, especially China, and control over the Northern Passage. And so we have no military to speak of. And so we can't defend our own country. We can't defend the Northern Passage and Northwest Territories up in the top of our country. And so that's why he's concerned about Panama too. He wants to get the control of that back. Not whether they actually own it or not, it's not an issue, but he wants to be able to get in and out of that and not be interfered with, so he can go from coast to coast and control the Western Hemisphere. So that's what Trump is after. And so there's a number of things going on, but the tariff thing, I think, is a sideshow for us at this point. What we need to do is figure out how we're going to work with the Americans and diversify our risk as a country so that we can ship some of our commodities to a few other countries and work better internally within our own country. So I think that's the bigger picture that's going on, and I think it sort of rounds it all out. I think most Canadians, even myself, I mean, I knew that there's been money laundering going on in Vancouver for years, and that's all the Chinese money's been coming in for decades. But the full extent of it, I guess he's drawn our attention to it a bit more, I must say. Mm-hmm. And you see, what's Cooper's book on willful blindness and so forth.
Yeah, that was the interview. That was the interview that we covered in our episode. Yeah.
And I think we're finding out how corrupt our political establishment is. Mm-hmm. And they run around, pound their chests, and that they're righteous. And what's Doug Ford done to help with all the truckers running around shipping stuff across the border that we shouldn't be doing? There's just a lot of illegal activities going on, and now Trump is saying, "Hey, listen, Canada, you're our neighbor, you're an important neighbor, and we're not going to stand for it, or we will hit you over the head, and we can hit you over the head very hard." We do not want to get into a trade war with the United States. That's just insane.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
It's a 10 to 1 ratio, basically. In other words, we send $10 over to the States, and they send maybe $1, back over at us, and so they can take the pain. It would cripple us, and so we don't want to get into a trade war. Anyone who pounds their chest and says we want to go into a 1-for-1 trade war with the United States is crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah. But the weird part, Jonathan, is that was the rhetoric that came from so many, like every party leader, every party leader was saying, well, let's get to dollar tariff. Crazy. And we're gonna take away American booze off our shelves, and that'll show them. That was kind of the play. But we touched on our program is essentially what they're doing is now they're hurting the Canadian consumer. Not only is Canadian manufacturing going to be greatly damaged by the tariffs, but then the Canadian consumer would also be greatly hurt as well.
While everyone's talking about those tariffs, what about the carbon taxes that are coming in April? I mean, our government continues to basically bludgeon us with taxes.
Okay, don't get too far ahead. Don't get too far ahead, because we need to talk about that. I'm just struck by the fact that Donald Trump, art of the deal. Everybody, I don't think the left can figure out, is this guy a evil mastermind or is he a total idiot? But I think the way that his new administration has really hit the ground running shows that in his first go around as president, he didn't have the lay of the land. Now that he has the lay of the land, he knows where the bodies are buried. He has, I think, better people around him to start off this time, and they have a distinct view of where they want to go. And as you're saying, Jonathan, in using the stick to beat back Canada, which is 25% tariffs across the board, he really immediately accomplished his first goal, which is let's shore up the borders. That's the first thing on the table. We need to deal with personal sovereignty, get control of our borders, and deal with the flood of illegal drugs and illegal immigrants in our country. So if I can parry back China's influence, if I can establish ourselves on a good foundation, secure our borders, that's the first thing. And then secondly, as you just said, this has the added benefit of setting the table for the negotiations that are coming up. So in the one threat, he has done at least 2 or 3 different things, right? So, I mean, it's a masterful play. But maybe just for our listeners, because I don't know, there's been a lot of tariffs, but I know you're a guy who actually can help us think through tariffs, because I think there's a lot of misconception out there. So I just want to, before we get too far afield, help us think through, like, what are tariffs? What do they generally do? What are their purpose? And who pays a tariff, Jonathan? Is it true that it's the Americans that are paying it, or the Canadians that are paying it if the Americans are putting on us, or vice versa? Maybe help us think through this, and then we can kind of have a more enlightened conversation.
Well, basically, it's a tax. So it's a tax. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, if we are shipping items, say you're selling things into the United States and they put a 25% tax on it, then whoever is importing it, that would be the American, would have to pay that tax to the government. And so that puts the price of that goods up. So then you say, well, what's that going to do? Well, that person is not going to want to import your good because they won't be able to sell it in the marketplace. It's going to be priced out of the market. So what do? They're going to look for a domestic producer. They're not going to be buying foreign items. So basically, by putting that tax on, it's squeezing out, it's making it more difficult for foreign products to come into your country because it's putting the cost of them up. And so that's the whole point about it. He's saying if you want entry point into our economy, then you either are going to have to sell at an incredibly competitive price, or basically you're going to be priced out of the marketplace, and you're never going to sell into our country. And so that's the whole point of the tariff. That's why, again, people have used tariffs over the years in order to protect their own domestic businesses, their own domestic production, their own domestic services. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, obviously that's where he has such a big advantage to us, is there's no bigger and more wealthy market in the world as far as dollar for dollar than America. So every single person wants access to that market at competitive rates.
And that, you see, what he's trying to do, what he's talked about, and this is going to be difficult, but he's going to try it, I guess. I just heard this Treasury Secretary talking about this, and Ludnick, his secretary, his other finance guys, top guys, speaking about it. And remember, the folks that Trump has around him, these cabinet ministers that he's putting into place, basically, I think it's fair to say, these are incredibly accomplished professionals. These are not stupid people. These are people who are very successful in their respective areas. Many of them are billionaires. Many of them have made a lot of money. They've driven businesses, very successful. And I just say, compare that to the cabinet that Trudeau has, and compare it to Trudeau himself. And I don't say
please
that.
Please don't. That hurts. It hurts to think about that.
Wait, like Melanie Jolie?
I don't
face.
Yeah, I don't say that again just to mock them. But we have incredibly incompetent people. We have not really taken these positions seriously. That Canada is a major country, major economy, and look at the people running these core areas, these different cabinet positions. So that's a serious issue. But in the States, what they're trying to do is change the revenue model. Okay, they're trying to cut personal taxes, become less dependent on taxes, and use tariffs as an entry point. So if you want an entry into the most dynamic, largest, free-flowing economy in the world, you're going to pay an entry fee to get in. That's what he's attempting to do. He's making this very clear. Mm-hmm. That's why I think Canada's going to have to.
So is what you're saying is he's turning the United States into Costco? You got to pay to get in.
Well, right? I mean, I guess that's one way of looking at it. But you see, what happens is if you're the largest economy in the world and you're changing the revenue model, one from personal taxation driving, the revenue base for the government, to one of tariffs, then you're going to force that change on the world, because the world won't be able to compete with you.
And when your dollar is the world standard,
it's very difficult. And so I think, and I think what's behind all of this is what you already pointed out in terms of one of your speakers was talking about previously, is that the U.S. has basically exported a lot of its wealth over the years by this whole outsourcing, and he's tired of doing that. And also, guys, it's not sustainable. We're getting to the end of the game here. The debt's too large. The global debt's like 350% to GDP, global GDP. These are levels that we've never seen in the history of the world. And partly because we can financialize them and trade pieces of paper, and so we can ratchet up the debt a little easier, and we can print it more money more easily, and so on. And so he knows that, these guys know that there has to be a reset of some sort. And so that's part of all of what I think Trump is doing too. Now, the other side of that is, okay, if Trump is bolstering the U.S., he's making it a capital rich place. A spot that's going to encourage people to invest. We're seeing that. I mean, businesses are pouring money back into that country, where they're not going to pour it into Europe. They're not going to pour it into China. They're not going to pour it into India. Well, India maybe get a little bit of money, but into Japan. And so the U.S. becomes the only game in town. And if you've got a flow of capital in there, I'm telling you guys that it could potentially become incredibly productive, start growing that economy despite all of the problems. But that's at the cost of the rest of the world too. And the rest of the world's going to really feel it, because they won't be able to compete. They're going to be very unproductive. So it's quite interesting what he wants to do. And you think about it, he's running like a corporation. He's running like a competitive business. And he's saying, hey, wait a second, guys. We're going to run this thing for the interests of Americans. And I mean, by and large, I think it forces the world to reevaluate this gross amount of socialism and the huge bureaucracies that we've created in these governments that are inefficient, ineffective, and are basically bleeding us dry. And not just our country, but all through Europe and down into most of the countries of the world. And again, you've seen the change in South America through Malay and in Argentina and so forth, that there's being a real rethink of how we're going to do government and how we're going to fund it. And we're running out of room. I mean, there isn't much more room left.
Okay, so in the spirit of thinking about one's own nation and what's best in the well-being of one's own nation, I want to talk about Canada a little bit, and kind of us on our own. So I just pulled up on my phone. I wanted to get a snapshot of the value of the Canadian dollar just over the last couple of years. And the graph that I pulled up here, it basically, and we're down here right now. So it's not looking pretty good. I was also, someone had mentioned that the Global Affairs Canada website has recently scrubbed everything off of their website. But because of the web archive, I was able to look up, and basically from 2021 to 2025, there's something like 1,700 different operational initiatives. And even if half of them are overseas, some of these operations are in the 7, 8, 9-figure amounts of money going to Sudan and Asia and the Americas. And so we're spending way outside of our means. The value of our dollar is quite low. The Bank of Canada continues having to drop interest rates just to deal with it. The proposed $1.3 billion bailout, the tariff bailout, that's not going to happen, but it's going to be a $1.6 billion plan to tighten up our borders. So, I mean, we are in such a mess economically, and I think that's putting it lightly. Kind of walk us through, not so much in relation to the United States, but on our own, our spending, our debt, value of our dollar. Give us a little more of a detailed snapshot of what's happening in Canada right now, and what do Canadians need to know the situation is. Is it dire, or is it just, it's bad, but we'll make it through? Like, be real with us.
Yeah. Well, the current course is dire. The direction is terrible. It's dangerous. And so when you go back to the Harper years, which weren't that long ago, our dollar averaged well into the 80 cents to the US dollar. And twice during Stephen Harper's prime ministership, our dollar was higher than the US dollar. So that was back in '07, and then 2011, are we actually higher? So what has happened? We've basically seen Justin Trudeau, when he took over, expand the size of the state significantly, and so you've got much more revenue being absorbed by the state. Currently, it's around 46-47% of our GDP goes to one of the three levels of government. So federal, provincial, and municipal. So you have close to half of our GDP going into the most inefficient, ineffective, unaccountable part of the economy, the worst place to put it. And so if you ratchet up the size of the government, of course, you're going to squander the assets of the country. And they're going to waste it, and you're not going to get the multiplying effect that you're going to get if it goes into productive businesses and you're actually creating wealth. The second issue that Trudeau has done is that he made it very difficult through legislation. There's a number of things that he passed that made it difficult to invest in our resource sector. And so they've stymied project after project after project. Some people estimate that it's at least $500 billion worth of capital since he's been in power. So you're talking $400-500 billion of capital that was not invested in the country, that could have been invested in the country. And you think about that money being multiplied through, once it gets into one business, then it gets picked up into another business, and it would be multiplied many times over. And that's a huge issue. So now we haven't been investing back into our country. What does that do? We're not growing our productivity. We're not getting more production out of less. And in fact, our productivity is going down. In the States, productivity has been going up by 2 or 3%. Ours has basically been flat, if not negative. The other aspect is that he's been flooding our country with immigrants. Now, again, we know that Canada is a country of immigrants, but you have to be very careful how many immigrants you're taking in and whether these are individuals who are going to add to the production of the economy. What's happened is we've taken in more than we can assimilate within our infrastructure, schools, hospitals, roads, buildings, and so forth. And so that's created real estate issues. It's created problems in our healthcare system and a number of areas, schools, and so on. And you've also been bringing in a lot of refugees and people who are basically just on public dole. So we basically are bringing in a certain number of these immigrants, a fairly large number, on welfare. And so you're spiking the number in the population. The economy is really not growing. You've got inflation because you're printing money to pay some of these bills. And so our GDP, our total production of goods and services on a per capita basis or per person, is dropping. It's outrageous. And so our economy is in terrible condition. We're not really growing. I would argue we've probably done no growth, because what happens is growth is adjusted by the estimated inflation rate. And so if your inflation is higher than they say, that means your growth is lower than they say. And I suggest that we probably haven't been growing at all for a number of years if you actually are adjusting with real inflation numbers.
We looked at a chart, Jonathan, not too long ago, and it showed the G7 nations. I believe it was the fourth quarter of 2024, and it was interesting because the European nations kind of middling there with all the other ones. Then you have, actually, interestingly enough, Italy under Giorgia Meloni, quite significantly higher. The Italian gets the mugshot in there. Then obviously the States is just, their growth is far bigger than anybody else's. But it's interesting to see, because Canada, actually, we're kind of right along with Europe the whole time. And now we're breaking the other way from America and Italy. We're breaking from the pack, and we're diminishing quite significantly, which to me looks like, we're kind of in this dangerous position where we're in a stagflationary cycle, and that's very bad.
We're not getting the capital flows in, and so we're not getting the investments back into our country. And then at the same time, you're getting tax increases. I mean, you couldn't look. If we wanted to write out a program of how you're going to undermine an economy, you would follow the liberal plan. You literally would, step by step by step. And so what's happening then? Our economy is soft, and now our interest rates are quite a bit lower than the U.S. rates. And of course, that puts further pressure on our dollar, because why are you going to buy the U.S. dollar, the Canadian dollar? You're only going to get 2-3% interest if you can get double that in the United States. So our dollar tends to go down too. So it's a real mess. The interesting thing about it, though, is because Canada is such a rich country, you could reverse this, as we saw sort of some different circumstances, different nuances in the 1990s. But in the 1990s, our dollar was down to 62 cents. It was lower than it was today. And they called it the Northern Peso because of the debt that Mulrooney put on the books. And then that was further exacerbated in the early days of the Chrétien government and so forth. But we couldn't the capital markets were not supporting our debt markets. And so we had to do some slashing. You guys are too young to remember that, but I was in the securities industry in my first few years in the investment business. And so what would you do? I think in many of the policies that the Conservatives are laying out, and also Bernier's talked about, basically it's not rocket science. You have to cut taxes. You have to cut capital gains taxes. I mean, at least they've pulled that for a little while. But the worst thing you could do, again, is increase capital taxes. I mean, this is total insanity. We need capital. So cut taxes, cut the capital gains taxes, get the carbon taxes off of there. That's just a brutal tax because it basically is an inflationary tax on everything. And then you've got to slash the size of the government, similar to what we're seeing in the United States. We've got to go through and we've got to take a chainsaw basically to the bureaucracies, provincially and, of course, federally. Trudeau has just ratcheted up the size of the federal bureaucracy. And we also then have to encourage capital back in the country. We have to say we're open for capital flows. We have amazing projects in this country. We should also, and I just saw a poll today that said 80% of Canadians want to have pipelines to our coast because they've seen what's happened. So of course we need pipelines to our coast. We're bringing in a million barrels a day from Venezuela and Saudi Arabia into.
It's interesting seeing the convergence of some of these things. So someone just posted just the other day. I pulled something off of X that Canada imported $3 billion worth of oil from Nigeria in 2023, and Nigeria, the people there don't have to pay a carbon tax. And so here we are. So here's how it all comes together. So we're paying a carbon tax on our gas use, but also we're not allowed to produce our own gas. So that has multiple, or at least not the degree to which we should. So our economy isn't firing on all cylinders. Jobs that should exist don't exist. And we're paying a carbon tax on what we use, but then we're importing billions of dollars. We're paying billions of dollars to import gas from other countries. Those countries don't have carbon taxes, and we're not taxing them to sell us their gas with a carbon tax. And so all this stuff just compounds, and it's individually they're already bad, but you put it all together and it's just worse and worse and worse.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's a kind of stupidity.
So these things can be corrected. They must be corrected. But we need leadership, and we need to throw the guys that are in Ottawa, the guys and gals in Ottawa, and most of our provincial governments too, out of office. And we certainly, the last person we need is Mark Carney. Obviously, Christian Freeland's, but Mark Carney he's part of the problem. I mean, his ideas are exactly aligned with Trudeau. So we're in dire situation. Having said that, because we are such a rich country, I think we could, with good leadership, in a number of years, reverse a lot of this. I mean, again, aside from the spiritual elements, which we know are obviously very serious issues, but economically, we could make substantial changes, similar to what Malay's done in Argentina, because basically everything we're doing is wrong. So you just start to reverse some of those things. Human ingenuity is amazing. People's turn it back to the private sector. Let them take care of it. Let those decisions be made. And so, so to answer your question, it is dire. It's terrible political decisions now for 9 years, 10 years compounding. And we're going to have to reverse all of those dramatically. And if we did, I think that, again, we could see a dramatic uptick in our economy. And our dollar and so forth would go back up again, a fair bit. But, that's going to take some leadership.
Yeah. So on that note, so you're giving us your Make Canada Great Again hat. Go over to mehga.ca, mega.ca. Get your own hats. But while you're giving us that plan, what would your plan be? We've seen the reaction from Canadian political leaders with the threat of tariffs. Obviously, we've seen armistice in the trade wars. But the threat still looms over Canada's head. How, Jonathan Wellum, if you were in the position of leadership, would you deal with this kind of new economic landscape that Donald Trump wants to do, and that the world's probably going to be forced to do? If he really wants to do it, we're going to be forced to do it. So how, with all this stuff set on the table, would you be approaching the relationship with the United States of America? And then how would you be positioning Canadians to make Canada great again, to create an economy that will flourish and thrive and be able to unlock the amazing amount of wealth that we as a nation actually have?
We want to go through the steps of what's going to make us as competitive and strong as possible, basically. And so what we want to do, if we're going to be able to compete with the States, or at least even have respect from the States, then we need to be a good, strong, competitive country. So we have to bring capital back. We have to open up capital. We got to get rid of regulations. We have to cut taxes, especially even if we were to cut all capital gains taxes to bring money back into this country. And we need to get rid of all these interprovincial restrictions. The trade restrictions in our province is ridiculous. You take the securities. I'm in the securities industry, and every single province has its own securities commission. It's just insane. So if you want to have we have investment product, we got to register it across every single province, including, little provinces like PEI and Nova Scotia and that. And we create all this duplication. So we've got to get that down. We've got to make ourselves competitive. And we also have to open up other markets that we can sell to along with the United States, so we're not just as dependent on them. Having said that, we need to keep very close to the U.S. We need to have open communications. We need to respect some of what they want to do, and we also need them, as we know, to protect our country. I mean, at the end of the day, we're not putting the money into our military, and so I think that's another area that we should be at least bolstering our military, so that we show that we have some concern for our own country and our own borders. So, if you want to deal with another strong country, we have to become stronger. We have to become more productive. We should, and these things are all doable. We've got smart people in our country. We shouldn't have the brain drain to the United States. We've got some pretty good universities turning out, tech graduates and all sorts of areas like University of Waterloo and so forth. Let's make this a place where they want to stay and work. And the way you do that is to free up the capital and let capital run freely and don't tax it, and encourage, private equity and venture capital. These are things you have to do in a country that's going to compete. And don't stifle them all, and dump the green agenda and drill baby drill and open up the competition. Even with data centers, I'm sure you guys know this. I mean, we live in an unusual situation where we could have a lot of data centers up here because cooler climates are better, and we've got natural gas coming out of our gazoo. I mean, we've got natural gas for 150, 200 years, and we've got so much.
We could be the AI hub of the world, doing all this stuff.
There's so many things that we could do. So, I mean, I think the thing, to answer your question, let's become strong and competitive. Let's grow our economy. We should be focused on production. Let's manufacture here. And then I think we would be in a better place to even negotiate and deal with the United States. But look, to the extent that, what Trump's doing down there, we should also look at all the ways possible we can work with them, not fight them, work with them. I mean, this is crazy. Yeah.
I think that's a great point, right? Because you're seeing countries in the world reposition themselves along these lines. You even saw with Ireland, right? Ireland, when everybody was talking about increasing capital gains tax across the world, what did Ireland do? They got rid of theirs. Tons of money flooded in their country. Now, would you believe it? It's like the sixth richest country in the world, and nobody would think of that. Ireland is being rich.
Yeah. What's interesting though with Ireland, not to get on a side topic, but they've built a lot of Ireland off tax arbitrage. By playing the tax system and having a bit lower. If Trump lowers the taxes in the United States where he wants to do it, that tax arbitrage is going to go away, and Ireland could be toast. Literally, Literally. So again, see, they've built a system on tax arbitrage, but are they producing things? You just don't want it all financialized. You want to be able to make things and have productive capacity. And again, we don't need to talk about Ireland in that situation, but getting back to Canada, we have a rich country, smart people, well educated. I mean, we can improve our education system, as we all know too. But in terms of capital, let it flow freely.
Yeah.
Let it flow freely. When you let that capital move and get government out of the way, all these bureaucrats, it's amazing what people are capable of doing and unleash it. And that's been the strength of the United States, despite all its problems. It still has the deepest capital markets, and that's why it's still the most successful. And what Trump wants to do is put that on steroids. I mean, that's as simple as that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can't help but think, like, as funny as the gaudy red hats are, having a vision like making America great again, it gives people something positive to get behind. It is building in a positive direction. So I think that's also the mindset that Canadians have to get back to. Instead of complaining or belly aching about what's happening in our nation, we have to take the handcuffs off our economy, and also have that positive vision to move forward as Canadians, building a great Canada again. And those are, though they're simple, like none of these things are rocket science, like you've talked about, Jonathan. This is really the antidote, and this is really what obviously the Christian worldview would put forward as the solution to our silly problems. But we have to really cast out the demonic spirit of socialism from our nation before we're probably ever going to do anything on a grand scale like this.
Well, as you know, if you're in a distributory economy, basically most of our politicians, all they're concerned about is redistribution or distribution. But you can't, if that's all you're focusing on, then your production goes down. You're going to have less and less to distribute, right? Because no one produces something on a regular basis if they think it's going to be pulled from them or stolen from them and taken away from them. They just won't produce as much. This is not rocket science. Again, as we've pointed out, you have to go production, and let the market determine that, and then, when you have to distribute some to help poor, and there's different things that we want to do, then you've got plenty in which you can distribute a portion of that. But you do that in a proper, ethical, moral, and just way, not an unjust way, as we know from a biblical perspective. And it changes the whole model. Right now, as you say, it's a good analogy. We basically handcuffed ourselves in Canada. We've handcuffed ourselves. We've done this to ourselves. Through the leadership that we've had, both federally, obviously federally most importantly, but also provincially across many of our provinces. Danielle Smith is a breath of fresh air. She's again not perfect, but she's really been pushing a much better agenda and pushing back against Trudeau. And again, he limited what the provinces could do legally, and then she sued him, as you know, and she won in the Supreme Court. And because they were literally trying to stifle and basically suffocate Alberta, and with all of these resources, even though they get all the transfer payments from them. You just wonder, like, what on earth are they doing? They want to kill the gold.
Basic math. So I don't think thinking is a huge thing that Trudeau does much of.
So Jonathan,
lots of emoting.
We've kind of started out here looking at the United States, kind of the global economy. We focused a little bit more on Canada and what is it we're doing, what our elected officials have been doing or not doing. Let's zoom in a little bit more. So let's think about the average Canadian, the person who's listening to this interview, a member of our audience. I mean, you sound like someone who knows what you're talking about. You kind of sound like you should be in the handling people's money business. I mean, that's just my opinion. I feel like that should probably be, I don't know if anyone's told you this before, but I think you seem like a trustworthy person in dealing with helping people manage their wealth. So with that in mind, the average Canadian, other than telling them, obviously, don't vote for the Liberal, don't vote for the Marxists, that's bad. Other than that, which is a given, the average Canadian who is looking at their bills, they're trying to make sense of their spending, who might be terrified right now, where people might be getting very insular, thinking, well, now is not the time to take risks. Now is not the time to step out. Now is not the time to try new things. Now's the time to hunker down and kind of turtle, and then hopefully wait for things to turn around. I'm sure people are thinking that way. I mean, obviously you want to be wise with your spending, and you don't want to be wasteful. You want to be a good steward of what God's given you. But it is a mindset of, let's just focus in and let's just be totally insular in our thinking, in our approach. How would you, big level and maybe even some specific ways, what sort of things would you tell to Canadians who, especially those who believe that God has made the world to work a certain way and that there are economic laws that exist because God's made them to be that way? How would you encourage them in this time? How would you advise them in this time to be more prudent and also steward what God's given them, and maybe help them to think in a way other than, let me just take all my money and shove it under my mattress and then wait for everything to blow over, and then I'll come out of the other end and, we'll be fine for a little bit? What would you say to people who are wrestling with these kinds of things?
Yeah, I mean, first I would start with the idea that, again, especially for Christians, that we realize that God is in control and He is sovereign, and so we ultimately have to rest upon His sovereignty, and that's going to found us and build the foundation for everything that we do. The second thing is that God has given us certain principles that we're to operate on, whether good times, bad times, scary times. And those principles are that, we are to develop a budget. We're to, live within our means, and we are to work hard and be as productive as possible. And in this environment, it might mean, again, just, taking some risk in a job and trying to see if you can't earn some more money, produce something, get, more independence. Don't be dependent on, say a large corporation. So you might want to start up a business. All of these things you should look at and think about, especially if you're younger and you can take on more risk. But also part of that is saving, setting money aside. Even if it's a relatively small amount, the discipline of setting aside even just a little bit of money is very, very important. It's also very important, of course, is to give back to the Lord, and He will also says that He will bless in many different ways as we give to Him. And that's not, again, a prosperity gospel. That's just proper stewardship. We are to, again, He's to get the first fruits off the top. And so I think we have to be faithful. We have to follow those basic principles, whether we are scared of the future or not, because the future ultimately is in the Lord's hands, and we don't know what's around the corner. And often we can be scared out of very prudent and rational and biblically oriented decisions by being paralyzed. And so we don't want to be paralyzed. And then we want to look, we're in the money management business. What do we do? So we have to manage people's money. We then say, we look out in the economy and we say, are there areas that we think are longer term growth areas where, the economy, as best as we can tell for the next number of years, is going to need to continue to invest. And then we will target certain industries and businesses that we think are well run, and we'll invest in those areas. But we also keep a little powder dry. We'll say, okay, let's keep a little reserve too, so that if we get volatility in the marketplace, we can dollar cost average and pick off different companies and so on. And then we also build positions in areas that maybe are more defensive, like hedges. And so for example, I'll give you some examples. So we have investments in, say, precious metals. A lot of people think about the precious metal space. So, we've owned gold, silver, and probably about 18% of our portfolios would be exposed to those type of businesses. And that's only gone up over the last couple of years because we look at the monetary situation. In other words, the debt and the interest rates and the crazy things governments are doing in terms of deficits. So we go, okay, fiat currency, that paper money, is not going to become more valuable. It's losing value. So we want to own stuff that will hold value. So we invest in that space. We invest in some of the electrical utilities, electrical producers, manufacturers. Like we have a company called Schneider Electric, for example, and they're big in data centers. They're big in refurbishing all of the electrical utilities across the world. And so why would we want to invest there? Is because we're going to need a lot more energy, and if we need more energy, then they're going to have to buy a lot of materials from a company, say like Schneider, for example. We own different infrastructure companies, pipeline companies, the companies that are going to be increasing demand in the future. Insurance businesses, you have to insure a lot of this stuff. So what we're trying to do, and what we say to people is like, look, despite the negativity, despite some of the challenges, you have to assume a continuity in the world, because God ultimately is the only one that's going to wrap up the world. And then we want to be as prudent as possible by looking at honest, ethical businesses that are well positioned and we can build a diversified portfolio that makes sense, cognizant of the challenges that we're facing. So certain areas that we've stayed clear of. We're kind of careful about some of the banks. They've got a lot of debt on them, so we're careful there. We're also not buying a lot of luxury goods items. We think that the world, there's a lot of pressure around the world, so those aren't necessarily the best businesses to be buying. So there's areas that we'll stay clear of also, just because we think, you know what, if the economy is going to struggle a little bit, let's not go there. Let's stick to really basic companies. But I think the answer to your question is that we go back to our principles. We trust the Lord. We go back to the principles that the scriptures have given us in terms of disciplines, setting aside money, preparing for our families, having a strong work ethic, and being optimistic but not naive, because our optimism is also ultimately in the Lord. We get up every day. We're excited with every day because God has made the new day for us. He's put us here in this world at this point in time to be His ambassadors for Christ and to have all the influence we possibly can. And that's a real challenge, and it's a wonderful privilege too to be a Christian and to serve the Lord.
Well, I can't help but think, you talked about tax arbitrage and Ireland building wealth via that. I can't help but think there's actually a worldview arbitrage that Christians can engage in at this very time, because we have, an objective standard that gives us these principles that you're talking about. We can actually better step back and assess what is actually going on around us. And it's that currency that's of great wealth, the word of the Lord being our foundation, that then can help us actually be prudent even in times of tumult and uncertainty and all these things. Because like you're talking about, you guys have a strategy, and in that strategy, I can't help but, in the ways that you're thinking, you guys are hedging, and also, some of your stuff very simple, but it's also counterintuitive to the reigning kind of idea of economics that's around the world that has gotten us into this mess. So I think that's really valuable. That's very, very, very interesting. And that's why I think, if you're listening to this program, we're not just saying it because we're friends of Jonathan and we value his advice, but there's much that you can do with Rocklinc Investments. And we would encourage you to, try and get a little bit of that worldview arbitrage by going over them and seeing how they can help you out.
Well, one of the benefits of money is it's, of course, it's very transportable, and you can move, Canadians, we don't have to have all our money invested in Canada. So if you have your home, which is a big asset for most people, then the financial assets, most of our financial assets would be in US-based companies. So if you see that arbitrage is taking place, if Donald Trump continues to ignite the US economy, then owning some of those US businesses, many of them deal, of course, in Canada also, that's probably a safer place to invest than, say, in the Far East, or even in Europe, for that matter, or even in Japan. And so that's a good thing about money. We can move it through the free markets to the best place, to some of the best companies. And that's a big advantage too when you're looking at it from, again, a Christian perspective, and you're seeing what's going on in the big picture. A lot of money management today is you just buy index funds, you buy exchange traded funds, and you just diversify yourself everywhere. Our view is no, hone in on a few areas, know them well, and know why you want to own these businesses for very specific reasons. And that will give you an added degree of protection, and I think ultimately a higher degree of growth over time.
So rocklinc.com is a website, Rocklinc with the C. info@rocklinc.com is the email address if people want to reach out. 905-631-5462 is the phone number for people if they want to call. You guys are on Facebook. You're on X as well if people want to follow you there. You as well personally, Jonathan are. So we would encourage people to follow you guys, like you guys on social media, check out your website, ask questions. If anyone's listening, especially if you are business owner, employer, and you're seriously thinking about your investments, you're thinking about your retirement, you're thinking about what to do with the wealth that the Lord has given you, how to steward it responsibly for your kids and your grandkids, and you haven't already, strongly urge you to connect with the brothers over at Rocklinc, and I'm sure they'd be willing to have you over for a coffee and a good chat as well in that wonderful conference room, as I've been in a few times at least. So, Jonathan, we really appreciate the time. Thank you so much for joining us on Liberty Dispatch Interviews. This has been good.
Yeah, it's a privilege to talk with you guys. Really appreciate the work you're doing, and keep it up. It's part of getting information, truth out into the market, and then catalyzing people's behavior to make a difference.
Awesome, brother. Well, we love having you on, Jonathan. Hopefully we'll speak very soon.
Liberty Dispatch has been brought to you by SDG Media. If you want to stay in touch with us and all things Liberty Dispatch, join our email list, or support the show, head over to ldcanada.substack.com.